The gritty remake of Kamen Rider Black has finally dropped in the form of Amazon Prime's 10-episode series, Kamen Rider Black Sun, taking itself a bit more mature in tone than even the previous outing of 2016's Amazons. First announced last year during Kamen Rider's 50th anniversary press conference, what started off as a confusing back and forth whether or not it was going to be a movie or a series, turned out to be dropped as a binge model series. Since this show dropped all at once, I won't do an episode per episode breakdown, especially since due to this format, there is no room for speculation, weekly conversations, or drummed up hype, since you could have just sat through it in one outing. Let me just preface things by saying that I am not a big fan of this model, for the previously mentioned reasons. Some people have time to binge 9 or so hours of content in one sitting, while some of us can't. Then there's the whole fear of spoilers, in which I actually had 2 major moments spoiled for me ahead of time just because I wasn't able to sit through all of it in one day. This kind of cheapened some of the moments, as it kind of set my mind into thinking when this part was going to happen or what led to it. Now, before jumping into heavy spoilers regarding the plot details, I'll be as vague as possible regarding some of my impressions after watching the series, and then going back and rewatching the first set of episodes and some key moments in other episodes. As mentioned in my previous Black Sun video, it seemed that this series was mostly just going to be taking names and some events and changing everything else. And although I know that some are going to argue that they can't get or don't like that this series is trying to tackle modern social political discourse, my first thing is that Kamen Rider and most toku shows as a whole, from the start, have been building off what were then recent events, with a lot of Showa era still dealing with the recent memory of World War II and several acts committed during that time. This issue always becomes that as time passes by, so too does society. The sting of such major events barely mean anything for a demographic that did not live or hear secondhand experience from those events. So instead, they chose to fast forward to something more recent that people can have some correlation to, regardless if you find it tone deaf or not. Now, when it comes to the characters of this series, I found that there is a common trope that plagued this show, and that is that the titular character doesn't feel like the main character. Kotaro appears to be a merc for hire, only taking on odd tasks to meet ends meet, though through interactions with the character of Aoi gets his call to action of sorts. A lot of the story tends to focus on a lot of these supporting characters, but 3 in particular: Nobuhiko, Bergenia, and Aoi. By the end of the series, all 3 of these characters, along with the supporting characters, were fleshed out in some surprising ways, and were handled pretty well for the most part. There are, however, some logistical, backstory, technique, and ability non-explainers, some ass-pulls, and those of the like that I did not enjoy and thought it dragged it back. So for the most part, although the series is good, has some completely raw action scenes and moments, some of the other items make it fall flat, with a key moment at the end that made it feel like it didn't stick the landing. Like I said, it's a good show. It's not great, it's not gonna revolutionize the franchise. If a sequel does happen, it'll be dramatically more different than a way that you'd think it'd be. So, with that said, I'll let those of you who haven't watched it yet leave here and come back later, because I'm about to break some things down. Spoiler mode is now on. You've been warned. In 3, 2, 1. The Creation King is a punk bitch. How the fuck do those drivers even work without their Kingstones? Shadow Moon doesn't even get the Saturn Saber. There is not even a proper explainer for how they go from those Blue Beetle knockoff forms to their rider forms. How the hell do those bikes even work after 50 years of buildup? That shit's gotta be made of Gundanium alloy or some shit. Battle Hopper got shafted. How the hell does Aoi get a driver? Why does the Creation King just let these folks trap him up in a crate just fine, but when Kotaro shows up like sup, he just busts his leg? Is heaven just jello and antifreeze mixed together? Cause that's what it looks like. Alright, joking aside, let's get to some of the story beats here. The story ends up playing out in ways that we've seen shows tackle before, similar to Kamen Rider Kiva and CW's Arrow, where they tell a story through a convergent timeline of events, one in the past and one in the current day. The lead up to everything started back in the 1930s, where experimentation on prisoners of war in order to create military weapons was authorized by the Japanese government, most of which turned out to be unsuccessful. The chance timing of an eclipse, along with a grasshopper outbreak, mixed with the experimentation on a POW. This led to the Creation King being born. And although being all-powerful, he's merely used as an instrument by the government to create kaijins with his extract, known as Heaven, subjecting the semi-mindless being as just becoming like the queen of a hive. That's really it. That's his purpose. They would use the title of Creation King as a proper title to make sure that he were to stay protected, but in the process, also put down some failsafes just in case. As Kotaro and Nobuhiko were born on the same day of the eclipse, and years later on the next one, were implanted with the Kingstones necessary to determine the fate of the future for Kaijin kind. Now fast forward a decade or so into the 1970s, and there are Kaijin all around Japan. We have activism spreading wide in regards to giving Kaijin their due rights as citizens. There is a coalition group that forms between a few of the Kaijin, such as our dual century / not century kings, Birgania, and the future priests of Gorgum. But there are a few humans there as well, such as Yukari and Oliver Johnson, the latter of which coming to Japan to help with a cause that he felt hit pretty close to him. Together, they create Gorgum, a group with the intention of making lives easier for Kaijin kind. Their plan? Kidnap the Prime Minister's grandson and use him as leverage for getting their demands of equal rights. And although he agrees, he wishes to gain the Kaijin support for his future expansion efforts, and use them as their original intended purpose of military weapons, and is willing to hold the Creation King ransom just to get it. Though the trio of Darum, Bottom, and Bisham agree, Birgania is not about it. And when the rest of the group find out, they decide to take matters into their own hands and defect. They never properly explain if the Creation King was being housed by the government already, or if he was just freely accessible. I would think that if the Prime Minister was holding onto him, it would be the first, but also, how'd they just get free access to him? They lug in a big ass crate and then just carry him? You would think that after Birgania fucked everybody's shit up, that they'd put tighter security on that guy, but they literally just walk right in silently, manage to steal this guy silently, and he puts up no struggle as they just escape with this huge ass crate. I'm sorry, but there's a whole ass moment before and after this that logistically just make no sense to me. I'll do you all a favor and just cut out the rest of the recap, or else this will turn into Zio Agito's Marco Satsu ripoff, History of Kamen Rider Black Sun, which, actually, on the first draft of writing this, was essentially going to be just that. But I'm not going to take that away from Marco's. Also, I don't have editors like that, or else I'll just be here editing for like a week straight, if that was the case. Generally, I'll just get to my likes and dislikes and move on to my rating, and how I feel about the things that I do the way that I do. As mentioned before, I didn't feel that Kotaro was much of a character. You can kind of argue that he's similar to his original incarnation in a lot of the early episodes, where a lot of times it's really just someone else's story playing out and he just happens to conveniently drive on by and get involved. But here it really feels like he's just playing second fiddle to everyone else. In the 70s, Nobuhiko has the most demanding presence, and he's just the player 2 palette swap, only feeling the need to do something different when swayed by Yukari. Then later on in the modern time, running into Aoi after a hit job that went so wrong but oh so fabulous. And the revelation of her having his Kingstone, he eventually gets swayed by her on what path he should go, eventually finishing things off where they started after getting the revelation regarding Black Sun and Nobuhiko's intended creation. Nobuhiko, on the other hand, gets vastly more screen time and fleshing out, but he kind of falls short by the end, going from wanting coexistence, then leading Kaijins to overtake humanity as a proper superior race, feeling like a true hero to the Kaijin, and in this universe fitting in with the Ishinomori standards of what it meant to be a Kamen Rider. That man spent 50 years in prison, but when planted with the seed that maybe, if someone had a strong enough will, then their version of the Creation King wouldn't just be some diet brainwashed version. then maybe he'd have all the power to really make a dent in things. His view of Kaijin's superiority was pretty much his own, but Kotaro's one for leaving Kaijins up to their own lifespans without a creation king wasn't his. But either way, it was their struggle between their morals and ideals that led to many of the confrontations and uneasy alliances. What does feel a little bit missing is a bit of a brotherly bond, since we know that they grew up together. Since in this version we have a duo that was turned into Kaijins early in life, but lived with that lifestyle for about 20 or so years before the events really pop off in the 1970s. The fighting and just overall brutality of things was done so well, but they did have one or two costume mishaps that at the end ended me sucking out of the moment. The fight between Black Sun and the Creation King was as awkward as a fight with an animatronic puppet could possibly get, but it was alright at times. It definitely gave off that bit of 90s Kamen Rider movie phase feel. Same with the final fight between Black Sun and Shadow Moon, though without the satin saber fuckery, pulling out their additional limbs as sword was a nice touch that actually ended up making their new suits look a lot more like their originals. We do get a rider kick and eventually a punch, but was it just me or did they feel kind of weightless? I would have honestly preferred if we've gotten a shadow kick versus a rider kick, but yeah, it is what it is. Nobuhiko's quick turn after getting the rationale punched out of him was also just too quick, and then he just dies after giving Kotaro his Kingstone. It kind of just didn't hit for me. Kotaro is then forced to become the new Creation King, but sadly proves that his will is not enough to really overcome this new state. That is, until Aoi is essentially the main character of this series from the modern perspective. Finding herself to be the voice of coexistence, her journey down the path of discovering the truth behind the Kaijin, the government's manipulation and use for them, her foster mother is murdered, her friend is essentially killed twice, her father is turned into a Kaijin, tries to kill her only to get killed himself, only for Aoi to then get turned into a Kaijin, and then has her own mother killed. This girl goes through some shit. I still don't know how or why she gets her own driver. It feels like an ass pull to me. A lot of her powers really aren't explained. And if I'm gonna try and headcanonize everything, I would just say that maybe she had some residual effects from carrying around the Kingstone for like 10 years, but still makes no fucking sense on how and why these drivers function. Aoi goes from full-on pacifist to rebellion by the end of things, training the next generation to continue to take the fight against the corruption of the world at large, as evil doesn't have to be limited to just humans, but Kaijins too, such as justice can also exist within all sides as well. Belgenia was the surprise character for me, as this man was just done so well. He was the most loyal to the cause, being the most faithful to the Creation King and the Kaijin as a whole at first. He was loyal to a fault, and that's what did him in, eventually having to literally bite his own tongue into another shot. The thing is, after getting the revelation regarding the backstory of the Kaijin and the Creation King, he knows that a replacement Creation King needs to be made. But he'd rather let another become it, forcing Aoi to become a Kaijin and then murdering her mother right after. This dude was a real one, but he gets the short end of the stick no matter what side he's on, from the Prime Minister and later on from Nobuhiko, eventually getting his redemption arc after an uneasy alliance with Aoi, protecting her from a police attack during her final speech to the UN. With rating, I tried being as objective as possible and judging the series for what it was and not what came before. Like I said before, it's good. It's a solid show, but the ending just missed the mark for me, even though I get what they're doing. So overall, this series is getting the Black Sun B. Right? There's a lot to like about Kamen Rider Black Sun. Overall, the binge model can be seen as a blessing and a curse. If it had released week to week, then the discussion would have kept the show a little bit more livelier in people's minds. We'd have weekly speculations and all that good stuff that we get in my other reviews. The flip side is that obviously in this line of the fandom, speculation ages like milk almost the next week. And with a remake such as this, some folks would try and find the connection between this and its source material and just get disappointed on some fronts. The binge model avoided all of that but kind of squashed many discussions, because not everyone goes at the same pace of consuming a large amount of content. Especially with the real life shit I've got going on, it's just hard to do. And like I said, I ended up getting spoiled on a few things. Most notably was Aoi getting a driver. I was only 3 episodes in when I saw it, and it completely made my viewing experience change since I was expecting it now. The big reveal was that the Creation King and the Kaijins are once again the trope that man really is the ultimate evil. And that's honestly just a played out trope for me. It's a note that we've been hitting on for a little bit too long now, but I guess it's to keep some level of realism in this show. With the usual, if man doesn't kill man, then man will eventually create something that will. The Creation King being some no-name prisoner of war to create blue water that will just turn into jello when froze to was also just My favorite thing about this show really was the characters, outside of Kotaro. And I've already listed a few, but here's a few more. Nick being revealed to be Oliver's son was something that I saw a mile away, but originally I was thinking grandson. But I guess Oliver just got a late start at having kids. But him being the source of a lot of the information for Aoi, and the way that he went around getting it, just for the hopes that he could become a Kaijin and eventually doing so. And even though this is like a D-side plot, it was played off exceptionally well. Donami was your typical hated politician type, and you just hated that guy. That's what he existed for. He captured humans of certain social standings and just fed them to the Creation King to continue pumping out Kaijins just to sell on the black market. Having this asshole eventually get killed by Nick brutally at that, as justice for his father, icing on the cake. Though with that, the revelation that Donami's successor will continue down the path of weaponizing Kaijin and taking Japan as a global power had me hoping that he was going to call a special crisis task force. But that didn't happen. But we did have several seed plants for a potential sequel. But with Aoi likely inheriting the black name and being RX, it's too much of a setup not to. Overall, I'm not blown away by this show like I feel others are. It's a good show with flaws in its backstory and setups, with some key moments missing to shed light on certain events. The fight choreography for the most part was top tier, but there are a few awkward and weightless moments. The soundtrack is pretty good, but there's really just the outro and the theme song instrumental that hits right as the fights are about to go down. The fact that this is available on Amazon Prime outside of Japan is also a good thing and a step in the right direction. Also, the fan service at the start of episode 10 will probably be my favorite of the series, as it instantly made me fail No Nut November. Buckets! Anyway, what did you all think about Kamen Rider Black Sun? Did the binge model work for you? How do you feel about the more basic explainer to the Kaijins? Did you feel that Kotaro was pretty much just a B-level character? How about all that blue water jello? Trying to review something all at once versus episode by episode is very difficult for a reviewer like me to do. So I appreciate your patience and understanding that I do all this shit myself. So if I were to do a full breakdown, it would take weeks for me to complete it all. So that's it for me. Was the lead up to the series worth it to you? Until next time, bye. You know what's funny is I've had this jacket since like 2008, 2009, without realizing at the time that this is the exact style jacket that Kotaro wore in Kamen Rider Decade when he henshined. What are the odds of that? I honestly had no idea until like a couple weeks back.